Imagine you're flying at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany in the middle of World War II. The freezing wind cuts through your bomber. The sky is filled with black bursts of flak, and dozens of enemy fighters are diving straight at you. You and your crew are aboard the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the toughest bombers America ever built. But here's the catch: your survival doesn't just depend on your own guns. It depends on the man flying beside you, the squadron in front of you, and the entire formation of bombers around you. Because the B-17 wasn't just a bomber. It was part of a living, breathing, flying fortress in the sky. And the way these bombers learned to fly together, defend one another, and evolve their formations would decide whether they survived or went down in flames. Today, we're diving deep into the incredible story of how the B-17's defensive formations evolved. And trust me, by the end, you'll understand why enemy pilots used to call them the porcupines of the sky. When the B-17 first rolled off Boeing's assembly line in the late 1930s, it was already considered revolutionary. Armed with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, it earned its nickname, Flying Fortress. Even before its first combat mission, American strategists believed that with enough guns pointing in every direction, the bomber could defend itself without the need for fighter escorts. It was a bold idea, almost arrogant, but it shaped how the U.S. Army Air Forces planned their bombing campaigns. The B-17 wasn't designed to sneak into enemy territory. It was built to fight its way in, drop its bombs, and fight its way out. But while the theory sounded good on paper, reality in the skies over Europe would prove far more brutal. When the U.S. first joined the war in Europe, B-17 crews flew in relatively loose formations. Each bomber relied mostly on its own firepower to keep enemy fighters away. But Luftwaffe pilots were quick to spot the weakness. They discovered that attacking in coordinated waves could overwhelm a single bomber's defenses. The results were devastating. Bombers strayed from their groups, gaps opened in the formations, and German fighters exploited every weakness. Losses mounted quickly, and it became clear that a new strategy was needed. The B-17 might have been strong, but one bomber alone was never strong enough. Survival meant teamwork, and that's where the evolution of the bomber formation truly began. After the early disasters, U.S. bomber commanders realized that survival depended not just on individual gunners, but on overlapping fields of fire. Enter the combat box formation. Instead of flying loosely, B-17s were arranged in tight, staggered groups, stacked vertically and horizontally. This meant that each bomber wasn't just defending itself. It was covering the blind spots of the aircraft beside it. A bomber at the top could fire downward to protect those below. One on the flank could sweep its guns across the sides. Suddenly, enemy fighters diving in from the front had to fly through a hurricane of .50 caliber bullets crisscrossing from every angle. The Luftwaffe quickly learned that attacking a tight box was like charging into a spiked wall of steel and fire. The box became the backbone of American daylight bombing doctrine, and it transformed the skies over Europe into a deadly chessboard of strategy, where formation discipline was the difference between life and death. Flying in such tight formations, however, was no easy feat. Pilots had to keep their bombers locked in position, sometimes within just 30 feet of the next plane, while flying through flak bursts and violent turbulence. Imagine trying to hold a massive 4-engine bomber steady while anti-aircraft shells explode around you, shaking the entire sky. A single wrong move could cause mid-air collisions, and entire groups had been lost not to the enemy, but to accidents inside their own formation. Yet discipline was enforced with iron resolve. Crews were drilled endlessly, and the message was clear: break formation, and you put everyone at risk. To the men inside those freezing metal holes, formation flying became both a shield and a prison. They couldn't maneuver freely. They couldn't dodge danger. They had to trust the system, trust each other, and trust that the combined firepower of the box would keep them alive. Of course, the Germans weren't going to let the Americans have it easy. Luftwaffe tacticians studied the combat box closely, looking for weaknesses. They quickly realized that while the formation was strong, it wasn't invincible. Large groups of fighters would mass for coordinated attacks, diving from head-on or climbing from below, where the bombers' guns had limited range. Even with the box, losses could still be catastrophic. On infamous missions like the raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, entire waves of B-17s were torn apart despite their tight formations. Dozens of flying fortresses fell in flames, their defensive firepower simply overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of German fighters. These brutal battles proved two things. First, that the formation concept worked better than solo flying, but second, that the bombers could never go it alone forever. Something more was needed. As the U.S. bombing campaign intensified, commanders realized that the key to survival wasn't just the box formation, it was scale. Instead of sending a dozen or two bombers, they began launching hundreds of B-17s in massive waves, each group protecting the other. When 3 or 4 boxes linked together, they created a flying fortress that stretched for miles across the sky. Imagine the sight: layer upon layer of silver bombers, sunlight flashing off their wings, bristling with machine guns in every direction. To German pilots, it was like charging into a fortress city in the air. Every attack run meant threading through overlapping streams of .50 caliber fire, where one mistake could mean getting shredded before you even squeezed the trigger. Yet this strength came with a price. Flying in such massive formations made the bombers predictable. Once the Germans spotted them, entire flak batteries and fighter wings could prepare ambushes well ahead of time. The B-17s were safer together, but they also became giant moving targets. Nothing tested the B-17's formation tactics more than the infamous raids on Schweinfurt, where American bombers targeted the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. On October 14, later remembered as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s roared toward the city in carefully arranged boxes. They flew without long-range escort fighters, relying solely on their defensive formations. The result was brutal. German fighters swarmed them in coordinated waves, hammering the formations again and again. Flak tore through the tight boxes, ripping apart bombers that couldn't maneuver out of the kill zone. By the time the survivors limped home, 60 bombers had been shot down, and over 600 men were dead or missing. The lesson was clear: even the tightest formation could not stand alone against the full fury of the Luftwaffe. The flying fortress had lived up to its name, but without support, even fortresses could fall. The U.S. commanders knew something had to change, or the bombing campaign would bleed itself dry. The solution came in the form of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang. Before their arrival, fighters such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could only protect bombers for part of the journey before running out of fuel. That left the B-17s exposed deep inside German territory. But when the Mustang arrived with its drop tanks and long legs, the entire strategy shifted. Now, bombers could keep their box formations while swarms of P-51s dove into the Luftwaffe, breaking up coordinated attacks before they reached the bombers. Suddenly, German pilots had to fight on two fronts: against the escorts and against the Porcupine Wall of bombers. This didn't make formations less important. It made them even stronger. With Mustangs overhead and B-17s locked tight in their boxes, the skies over Germany became a death trap for enemy fighters. What had once been a fragile strategy of survival became a devastating machine of destruction. By 1944, the combat box had matured into a finely tuned system. Instead of simple clusters, formations were arranged into wings and divisions, with each bomber's position carefully planned for maximum coverage. Leaders, high groups, and low groups all played specific roles. A lead ship would carry the navigator and bombardier responsible for the strike, while surrounding planes defended it from every direction. Pilots no longer just thought about flying their own bomber. They thought about how their position affected the survival of everyone else. Crews joked that they were flying inside a metal beehive. But the comparison was accurate. Each plane was a cell, working together for a single deadly sting at the heart of Germany. To Luftwaffe pilots, The formations now seemed less like targets of opportunity and more like massive, rolling fortresses that could not be cracked without horrendous losses. The B-17, once vulnerable, was now part of an airborne war machine that combined numbers, discipline, and escort power into something terrifyingly effective. One of the most overlooked aspects of the formation was psychological. For the crews inside the bombers, knowing that dozens of guns were covering their blind spots gave them the courage to keep flying through hell. At 25,000 feet, oxygen masks froze, engines rattled from flak bursts, and the enemy came in waves. But when you looked out your window and saw 3 other flying fortresses holding formation beside you, you felt less alone. The Germans might kill a few, but the formation would hold. That sense of unity, of being part of something larger, was a weapon in itself. German fighter pilots reported that the sheer sight of an unbroken bomber stream could sap morale before the first bullet was even fired. No matter how many Messerschmitts and Foch Wolfs they threw at the sky, the American boxes just kept coming. The psychological armor of the formation was every bit as important as the steel plates on the bombers themselves. While Europe was the primary battleground for the B-17, the lessons of formation flying carried over into other theaters of war. In the Pacific, where distances were greater and Japanese fighters attacked with different tactics, American crews still relied on the discipline of the combat box. The tight formations made it possible to strike heavily defended targets like Rabaul and Truk, where Japanese Flak and Zero fighters waited in swarms. Interestingly, Japanese pilots, like their German counterparts, came to respect and fear the defensive firepower of these formations. Time and again, bomber groups flying in boxes proved nearly impossible to break without suffering heavy losses. Even in a completely different theater, with different enemies, the principle remained the same: survival depended on teamwork. The box formation wasn't just a European innovation, it was the DNA of how the B-17 fought everywhere it went. As the war dragged on, formations didn't just evolve in shape, they evolved with technology. Improvements in gun turrets like the famous powered Chen turret added to later B-17G models closed earlier blind spots. Now, when German fighters screamed in for their favorite head-on attacks, they were met with streams of fire from multiple bombers at once. Inside the formations, radio communication grew more advanced. Lead bombers coordinated maneuvers, altitude changes, and even defensive turns so the group could act as one giant machine. On the ground, planners used intelligence to design strike packages where multiple wings of B-17s would converge on the same target from different angles, overwhelming defenses. What began as a desperate attempt to survive had become a sophisticated system of tactical warfare, where technology and human discipline fused together. The Flying Fortress no longer just relied on its nickname, it lived up to it, reinforced by every new gun mount, every new tactic, and every formation adjustment. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots had coined a chilling nickname for the B-17 formations: Fliegende Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. Just like a porcupine bristling with quills, the bomber boxes were dangerous to approach from any angle. Attack runs that had once been straightforward became suicide missions. Veteran German pilots remembered seeing comrades dive into the wall of fire, only for their aircraft to vanish in explosions of flame and debris. Even when they scored hits, it often came at horrific cost. This reputation alone began to change the balance of power. By the last year of the war, many Luftwaffe fighters avoided direct attacks on full formations, preferring to strike stragglers or isolated bombers that fell behind. The porcupine didn't just defend itself. It made the enemy think twice before even coming close. Fear had become part of the B-17's arsenal, and it was every bit as effective as the 50 calibers mounted in its turrets. As Allied production soared and escort fighters roamed freely across German skies, the once deadly challenges of daylight bombing began to shift. The Luftwaffe, bled dry of fuel and veteran pilots, could no longer mount the massive concentrated attacks that had once shredded American formations. Instead, smaller groups of German fighters faced swarms of B-17's flying in disciplined boxes, each wave escorted by Mustangs eager for a fight. For bomber crews, the difference was staggering. Missions that once ended with dozens of losses now often returned with only a handful of missing planes. The defensive formations had done their job. They had carried the U.S. Army Air Forces through the darkest days of unescorted raids, and had bought the time needed for long-range escort fighters to change the balance forever. By the time the Allies unleashed full-scale bombing campaigns in late 1944 and 1945, the sky belonged to the bomber streams, and the formation was the backbone of their power. While formations increased survival odds, nothing could erase the brutal reality inside a B-17. Crews endured 40-degree C freezing temperatures, frostbite, oxygen shortages, and the deafening roar of engines and gunfire. Even in the safety of a box, casualties were high. Gunners had to fire until their barrels glowed red. Bombardiers faced death head-on during runs, and waist gunners often collapsed from exhaustion after hours of combat. For many crews, staying in formation wasn't just about tactics. It was about trust. You trusted the bomber above not to collide, the one beside you to keep firing, and the entire group to hold steady no matter how bad it got. Survivors often said that the box wasn't just a formation, it was a brotherhood of steel, bound together by shared fear and determination. And for the men inside, every mission was a roll of the dice. Formation or not, death was always just one burst of flak away. If there was one nightmare every crew feared, it was becoming a straggler. A bomber damaged by flak or losing engine power often couldn't keep up with the tight box formation. Once it fell behind, it was doomed. German fighters pounced on stragglers like wolves tearing into a wounded deer, swarming from all angles, knowing no other bombers could cover them. Crews sometimes begged their pilot to push the crippled aircraft just a little longer to stay inside the protective umbrella of the box. Many stories of heroism came from these moments. Pilots refusing to bail out, engineers coaxing engines back to life, gunners fighting to the last bullet, just to hold on to the formation. In this way, the box wasn't just protection, it was salvation. To fall out meant near certain death, and every crew knew it. The sight of a lone fortress trailing smoke behind the formation was one of the most heartbreaking images of the air war. By the war's final year, formations were no longer seen as just defensive tools. They became strategic weapons in themselves. The massive streams of bombers, flying in precise boxes, were psychological weapons designed to crush German morale. Civilians on the ground described the terrifying sight of hundreds of bombers stretching across the horizon, blotting out the sun. For German soldiers and flak crews, the endless bomber stream symbolized an unstoppable industrial power. Even when individual bombers fell, the formation as a whole never seemed to break. It kept coming mission after mission, city after city, until the Reich's factories, railroads, and fuel supplies were reduced to rubble. The evolution of the box had carried the U.S. from theory to reality, turning bombing campaigns into a relentless war machine. The flying fortress wasn't just dropping bombs, it was rewriting how nations fought wars in the skies. After the war, aviation strategists around the world studied the B-17's formations closely. They discovered that the lessons of overlapping firepower, discipline, and group survival applied far beyond World War II. Even as technology shifted toward jet bombers and guided missiles, the concept of mutual protection remained. In Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, bomber groups would still echo the principles of the combat box. The B-17's defensive formations had proven that teamwork and coordination could turn vulnerable aircraft into nearly invincible war machines. To this day, Air Force academies teach about the combat box as a masterclass in tactical innovation born from necessity. It was one of the clearest examples of how war forces rapid evolution, and how survival often comes down to men adapting faster than their enemies. In the end, the story of the B-17's defensive formations is a story of men and machines learning to stand together. Alone, a bomber was just a target. But together, in boxes, in wings, in massive streams, They became something far greater, an airborne fortress that the Luftwaffe could never fully break. From the early disasters to the terrifying days of Schweinfurt, from the arrival of the P-51 Escorts to the final bombing campaigns that shattered Nazi industry, the box formation carried the U.S. Army Air Forces through one of history's most brutal air wars. It wasn't perfect. It cost thousands of lives. But without it, the strategic bombing campaign would have collapsed before it even began. The Flying Fortress lived up to its name not because of its armor or its guns alone, but because of the discipline, courage, and sacrifice of the men who held the formation, no matter what. And that is how the B-17's defensive formations evolved into one of the most legendary tactics in history of aerial warfare.